Hey students, this is going to be a lecture over the era of Jeffersonian democracy. This is chapter 7 in the Brinkley textbook, and I'm going to be going over some other sources here that I will share with you that I draw from and sort of put together when presenting this information. So books, Alan Brinkley's American History, 15th edition, in the textbook. This is pages 180 to 212 in the 15th edition. Also, an audiobook I've been using is History of the United States, 2nd edition. This is by the Great Courses, multiple authors, multiple lectures. It's great. And it combines like how you get U.S. History 1, U.S. History 2 in college. It combines it all into one gigantic audiobooks, like 34 hours or something like that. So it's really good. Follows a lot of the same themes, but it also has some different information. So it's great to look at both. So there are a couple book suggestions. Documentary resources. Okay, so for this chapter 7, where the era of Jeffersonian democracy, some must-watch documentaries, and I have these included in my course if you're taking me for this class. So Sally Hemings, Redefining History. This is an A&E documentary, and fantastic documentary. I really enjoy it. I show it every semester to students, and it's about this notion that Thomas Jefferson had a slave mistress who he fathered children with, named Sally Hemings. So check that out. I'm very excited to be sharing that with you. It is a good documentary. It's about 54 minutes long. Also, Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Corps of Discovery, a film by Ken Burns. This is in 2 parts, about 3+ hours total, but definitely worth your time. It is amazing. Thomas Jefferson, also a film by Ken Burns in 2 parts. Now, if you've never heard of Ken Burns, he's who does both of these. You should take your time and watch these. They are great. It may seem like a big investment in your time, but it is very worth it. They're very good. You're going to learn a lot, and they're going to help you with the information that's going to be included on this big section as I teach as Unit 3 in this course, which is Jeffersonian democracy, War of 1812, and Jacksonian democracy. Also, you have the era of good feelings in there. Okay, so my lecture notes, if you're taking me for this course, you have access to them. They come in part from all of the sources I've mentioned, but also from lecture notes when I took this class, U.S. History 1, as an undergraduate in college with Dr. Diane Gleason at Arkansas Tech University. So if you're taking me in this class, you're getting the composite version. So let's start setting the stage here, okay? Jefferson and his followers have assumed control of the federal government, right? Jefferson wins the election of 1800, the Revolution of 1800. I'll recap that in the next lecture. But in 1801, they start championing this version of Jeffersonian democracy, right? Which is a much, much different version than the Federalist and Alexander Hamilton had in mind and the vision that they had for the country. So the economy of the new republic is becoming steadily diversified and very complex all at the same time, right? Cities are growing. Commerce is surging. The economy is becoming much more diversified and complex. And industrialism is starting to take place in the United States, and it's expanding as well. So these changes are making the vision that Jefferson has for the country actually impossible to maintain. He envisions the country being the simple agrarian society populated with yeoman farmers. The Republicans are, like the Federalists before them, going to be able to translate many of their ideas into reality. Okay, Jefferson dismantles a lot of the bureaucratic power structure that the Federalists had erected in the 1790s. He helped ensure that the federal government would remain mostly just unimportant, is a fixture in the lives of Americans. And as you're going to see as we move forward and talk about Jefferson in detail, he's going to encounter situations in his first and second term in office that are really going to require him to sort of go against, and I guess you could say, his principles. He's going to be put in situations where he's going to have to use strong national authority. The greatest example to talk about where Jefferson does something that's not in the Constitution is Louisiana Purchase, right? So he's faced with all of these issues, and we'll be talking about how he deals with each one. Okay. Now, the Republicans did not always enjoy nationalizing and modernizing trends, but for the most part, they adjusted to them, right? The country's doing its thing, and they, in a sense, roll with the punches. So, in resisting some of these transformations, the Republicans, that is, these Jeffersonian Democrats, or the Democratic Republicans, whatever you want to call them, they might not enjoy these nationalizing trends. They might be blocking them in places, as we'll talk about, but they become agents of the transformation many times that they are trying to resist. Okay, so let's talk about the rise of cultural nationalism. Okay, American cultural life in the 19th century seemed to reflect the Republican vision of the nation's future. Educational opportunity, national literacy rates, and artistic life are all on the rise in the new republic. And during this time, the young country is finding an identity that is freeing itself of European influences. And I'm going to go into nationalism more in a moment, and you can kind of see why this is the theme of the beginning of this chapter, right? New American culture, in many ways, is posing a serious challenge to Republican ideas of Thomas Jefferson and his supporters as well. So let's talk about nationalism. What is nationalism? There are many types of nationalism. There's ethnic, civic, expansionistic, romantic, cultural, revolutionary, language, religious, ideological. These are all forms of nationalism. But I'm going to give you a couple of textbook definitions here, okay, and talk about cultural nationalism in the United States. So nationalism is the identification with one's own nation and support for its interest, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interest of other nations. It is an ideology and movement that promotes the interest of a particular nation or nations, especially with the aim of gaining and maintaining the nation's sovereignty over its homeland. Nationalism holds that each nation should govern itself free from outside influence. Now, cultural nationalism. This is a form of nationalism in which the nation is defined by a shared culture. It is an intermediate position between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. It focuses on a national identity being shaped by cultural traditions, but not on concepts of common ancestry of race, however. Now, no matter what form of nationalism you're talking about, the populations in the area that you're discussing believe that they share a common cultural bond of some kind. So let's talk about education in the United States during the era of Jeffersonian democracy, okay? Jefferson is going to lead what he calls a crusade against ignorance. So Jefferson, Democratic Republicans, they favor educating future voters from this all-white electorate of landowning men. So Jefferson, he wants to establish a system of public schools and public education, which he argued would help with this shaping of this idea that he had for the country. He's going to make this education, or he argues this education should be free for prospective voters. Not all states have public education in Jefferson's presidency. There are many private institutions, especially in the South. Not all people could afford to pay for private institutions. That's another issue. And in the South, these institutions are typically ran by religious groups, while in New England, in contrast, and other places in the country, private academies are typically secular. Okay, now let's talk about new educational opportunities for women. Okay, back to this idea of Republican motherhood. This is re-emphasized during Jefferson's presidency, and this is the notion that women should essentially raise children to become good citizens, right? That's why they should have an education. That's their role in the Republican process. So essentially, women should be educated so that they may help educate the electorate and to be better wives to their husbands and better mothers to their children. That is the view of the Jeffersonians, many of them. There was the view that there was no need for advanced or professional training for women, and certainly no reason for women to attend colleges or university. And because of this sort of stereotype, there's no colleges didn't make a point to even consider making room for female students. Female illiteracy rates during the American Revolution are around 50%. And immediately following. One woman we'll discuss, Judith Sargent Murray. She defended women's rights to education, argued that men and women were equal in intellect and their potential, and therefore they should have precisely the same educational opportunities. Murray's ideas they become an inspiration for later generations, but they are not appreciated and gain little traction during her own lifetime. I'll mention Murray just a little bit more in a moment. Now, African American education, what's going on with that? Virtually nothing. There's virtually no white people during this time that believed African Americans, essentially all of whom are slaves, should be educated. Slave owners did not want slaves to be educated. There was fear that knowledge may encourage rebellion. So in the South, slave owners typically tried to prevent their black workers from learning how to read or write, fearful that they would become unhappy with their condition. Now, some slaves did achieve literacy, but the numbers remained very small. In some northern states, some free black children attended segregated schools. Now, Native Americans, this is an interesting contrast. So there is an interesting idea that Native Americans should receive some sort of an education, right? There's this growing interest in this. Jefferson and his followers like to think of natives as, quote, noble savages, end quote. And they also thought about them as uncivilized, but they hoped that schooling the natives in white culture would tame and uplift their individual tribes. Most Americans viewed African Americans in a different light than Native Americans. African Americans in this time were viewed as innately inferior. Now, a few other comments on higher education. Much less widely available than education at lower levels, despite Republican hopes for a wide dispersion of advanced knowledge. There were 9 colleges at the onset of the Revolution. but this number grew to 22 by the year of 1800. Only 1 in 1,000 white men and no women, natives, or blacks would have access to higher education. There was training in the classics and theology, and the clergy was the only profession which college training was typically a prerequisite for. And law schools become more prominent also during this time period. Now, a few comments on medicine. The very first medical school in the United States is established during this time period, the University of Pennsylvania. Now, medical treatment was primitive. Barbers were often considered experts in the field, would sort of wear two hats. Physicians would use this technique known as bleeding as a means of treatment. For example, we have a Philadelphia physician, Benjamin Rush. He's a proponent of adequate sanitation as a means to prevent the spread of disease. Seems forward-thinking there. But he's also a proponent of bleeding and purging, which caused actually many patients to die. For example, it is believed that bleeding and purging had something to do with George Washington's death. He had just a minor throat infection, but was bled and purged in an attempt to cure it, and he did not recover from that issue. Now, midwives, this is a very common occupation for women in this time. This is a role where a woman would care for a mother and is with the mother during her pregnancy and after and at and after childbirth. Most childbirths before this time had been attended by female midwives, but early in the 19th century, physicians start handling deliveries themselves. And also demanded that restrictions be placed on midwives. So you start to see a schism there. Now, both education and professional training in medicine and many other fields, again, they fall short of the Jeffersonian vision that they had for the early republic. Now let's talk about American culture, okay? Now, there's a lot of idealism behind this, and this here's a quote taken from the Brinkley book that America would sort of serve as the last and greatest theater for the improvement of mankind. There's a few other phrases in there, but very idealistic. And Americans are seeking to form a cultural independence following the Revolution. They're seeking to form their own cultural identity that is uniquely not British. There's this desire to actually rival the literary and artistic achievements of the Europeans. One Massachusetts geographer stated that the United States must have its own textbooks in order to prevent the aristocratic ideas of England from infecting people. So that is one view there. Noah Webster publishes the American Spelling Book in 1783. He is a lawyer and schoolmaster from Connecticut, and Webster argued that American students should be educated as patriots, their minds filled with nationalistic American thoughts. His publications thought to encourage this sort of distinctive American culture that's developing in the New Republic. Now, Webster, he helped standardize the English language. One of the most popular books ever published was commonly known as The Blueback Speller, authored by Webster. It eventually sells over 1 million copies. And it becomes the best-selling book next to the Bible in the history of American publishing. Webster's School Dictionary is issued in 1806 and republished in many editions, and is eventually enlarged to become an American Dictionary of the English Language in 1828, the year that Andrew Jackson wins the presidency. Now, Washington Irving, a resident of New York State, he wins acclaim for his satirical histories of early American life and his powerful fables of society in the New World and in the New Republic. He authored popular American folk tales about the adventures of Ichabod Crane and Rip Van Winkle. I remember Ichabod Crane and the relationship of the Headless Horseman to the Revolution is that the Headless Horseman is a Hessian. So Irving is one of a few authors whose works would continue to be read in later generations, his works being published in this era of Jeffersonian democracy and this post-revolution. Mercy Otis Warren, she is a playwright and agitator during the 1770s. She authored a 3-volume work titled History of the Revolution, which was published in 1805. And here she emphasized the heroism behind the struggle of the American cause in the Revolution. Mason Weems, an Anglican clergyman, published Life of Washington in 1806, which becomes a bestseller. This work actually has little to do with history, though, and portrays Washington is this sort of simple Republican farmer with that's just a homespun man that possesses these simple virtues, and that is how oftentimes this aristocratic former president is cast. Now, Weems's Life of Washington, this is the origin of the famous Washington and the Cherry Tree tale. Now, religion in the United States during this time period, the American Revolution helped elevate a lot of ideas from the Enlightenment, but it weakened traditional forms of religion by detaching churches from government. So the idea of individual liberty and reason had all been elevated above religion. Now, only around 10% of white Americans were members of formal churches. Deism is still popular. After all, Thomas Jefferson, a deist, is in office as President of the United States. This idea had originated in France among the philosophers of the Enlightenment and deists. They accepted the existence of God, but they believed that God created the universe and then withdrew from direct involvement from the human race, and they considered God to be a remote being, uninvolved. This sort of divorcing, God divorcing himself, if that's a way to put it, from the decisions and sins of mankind. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine, in addition to Jefferson, are deists. Paine says during this time that Christianity was the strangest religion ever set up, for it committed a murder upon Jesus in order to redeem mankind from the sin of eating an apple. One way of putting it. Now, this comes from his publication, Age of Reason, which was published in parts between 1794 and 1796. Again, that is Thomas Paine. Now, in addition to deism, you have some additional movements. Unitarianism, also called Universalism. These emerge from dissenting views within the New England Congregational Church, right? So they're rejecting this Calvinist idea of predestination and arguing that salvation was available to all and believed that anyone could go to heaven. Now, they also rejected the idea of the Trinity, that is, this idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And they believed Jesus was a good person, a great religious teacher, but not a Messiah, Savior, or the Son of God. James Murray, who later marries Judith Sargent Murray, founded a Universalist church as a separate denomination in Massachusetts in 1779. And the Unitarian Church was established in Boston 3 years later. Both deism and Unitarianism are considered forms of what we would refer to as religious skepticism. Now, some believe that the spread of rationalism was bringing about an end to traditional evangelistic religion within the new nation. The fact is that most people's commitment to organized religion and churches and denominations to decline due to many considering them too formal or too traditional. So that was a lot of the issue. Now, deism, universalism, and Unitarianism, and other rational religions, as we'll call them, seemed more powerful than they actually ever became. Evangelicals were confused and disorganized when these religions sort of emerged, or when these rational religions emerged, rather. But this changes in 1801 when traditional religion stages a dramatic comeback in the form of the Second Great Awakening. So let's make some comments on the Second Great Awakening. A couple of pages of notes here, and then we'll get into industrialism. So this movement originates out of an effort of conservative theologians to fight the spread of religious rationalism and religious skepticism. It has its origins in the late 1790s and lasts as late as 1850. In the late 18th century, only 10% of Americans, as I mentioned, were members of a formal church, but the Second Great Awakening is going to be a great attempt to bring these people who have left their congregations back into the fold. So the First Great Awakening, if you recall, took place in the 1730s and 1740s and was a reaction to the Enlightenment and featured, much like the Second Great Awakening, emotional sermons. But your notable preachers of the First Great Awakening are Edwards and Whitefield. Now, the Second Great Awakening inspired this idea of perfectionism, the idea that one should seek, however, to live a perfect and morally virtuous life. In 1801, the first camp meeting or camp revival takes place in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Some mark this as the official beginning of the Second Great Awakening. 25,000 people total attend this religious event. The Burned Over District in western New York, this is where many conversions happened, but this is around the Buffalo and Rochester area. One famous preacher who delivered sermons here is Charles Finney. He is famous for preaching at camps and revivals across the country during this time. So there's this idea that your own goodwill and good works, this is sort of the overall message of the revolution, is that your own goodwill and good works could help you in achieving salvation. But there's also this call for individuals to connect with God. Sermons were often about spiritual rebirth, self-improvement, and again, perfectionism. And the message that God's grace could be obtained through faith and good deeds is something that emerges. There's a lot of focus on the individual and the individual's need to readmit God into their life and reject this idea of religious rationalism. So one thing I'll read you from the book here. The Methodist circuit riding preacher Peter Cartwright won national fame as he traveled from region to region, exhorting his listeners to embrace the church. Even Cartwright, however, was often unprepared for results of his efforts. A religious frenzy that at times produced convulsions, fits, rolling in the dirt, and twitching holy jerks. So that was something that really stood out. So, and again, that is Methodist circuit rider Peter Cartwright, and he would be similar to Finney, right? Finney was also preaching at these different camp meetings and riding circuits across the country. Now, the Second Great Awakening does not focus on predestination in really any way. Some of the effects of the Second Great Awakening, like the first, we see an increase of different sects and denominations. We see increased involvement of women, sometimes because of marriage prospects being diminished, but many women built their lives on this religious foundation during this time. Membership increases in Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches during the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening inspires reform movements in the 1830s and 1840s. This is one of the big takeaways, such as the abolition movement, which is concerned with the abolishment of slavery as an institution in the United States. The temperance movement, a crusade against drunkenness. Women played a major role in the temperance movement, and they argued that they bore the brunt of men's drunkenness and them spending money and being gone. Mental health reform and asylum reform by Dorothea Dix helped improve conditions for the mentally ill, and I'll talk about all these in later lectures in greater detail. Educational reform that in the 1830s is going on, prison reform, and also the emergence of utopian societies. But these are things that all evolve out of the Second Great Awakening. Utopian societies like Brook Farm in Massachusetts emerge, where residents share in their work and in their leisure. New Harmony in Indiana, and the Oneida community in New York. New Harmony is a village of cooperation where residents worked equally and shared labor tasks. Oneida in New York rejected traditional family and gender roles and practiced in free love. So in comparison, the First Great Awakening did not lead to these similar reform movements or the creation of utopian societies. So note that. A few notes on African Americans and the Second Great Awakening. And then we'll move on to Native Americans in the Second Great Awakening and how it influenced their communities. Many African Americans eagerly embraced the new religious fervor that accompanied this movement. African Americans did translate the religious message about salvation for all into a similar message for African Americans in their present world. Out of one revival meeting in Virginia arose an elaborate plan in the year 1800 devised by Gabriel Prosser, brother of an African American preacher, to form a slave rebellion and attack Richmond. Their plan is discovered, however, and thwarted, but this stirred a lot of racial unrest in the South. Native Americans in the Second Great Awakening. Handsome Lake was a Seneca prophet who had recovered from alcoholism after experiencing a rebirth, and he became very special to his tribe. And he was active in spreading a message from 1799 until his death in 1815, which called for the revival of native lifeways. He claimed to have met Jesus, who instructed him to tell natives that they will become lost when they follow the ways of the white man. His message spread throughout scattered Iroquois communities and inspired many natives to give up whiskey, gambling, and other destructive customs they derived from white society. Also, Handsome Lake urged Iroquois men to abandon their roles as hunters. So these Iroquois men would be commercial hunters, and they were struggling with this activity during this time due to encroachment on their lands and overhunting. And they encouraged him to become sedentary farmers instead. Now, women were traditionally the farmers in Iroquois society, but women were encouraged to take up more domestic roles. And when many women, which many did, resist, Handsome Lake would denounce them as witches. He demanded confessions from some and even had some killed for refusing. Sounds very similar to some of the themes of the Salem witch trials that I had to cover earlier on in this class. Now, the last major topic here is the stirrings of industrialism. So despite the Jeffersonian agenda becoming this simple agrarian paradise, the United States will not remain a simple agrarian republic. The nation will, in fact, take its first tentative steps in these years of the Jeffersonian era towards its transformation into an urban industrial society. And we're going to talk about a few people that play a very important role in this process. Samuel Slater, known as the father of the factory system in the United States, he is going to immigrate to the United States. But before we get into that, England has been preventing the export of textile machinery or skilled mechanics or any sort of person leaving the country which would have knowledge of textile machinery. So despite these efforts, immigrants do arrive in the United States with advanced knowledge of English technology and introduce new machines to America. Slater, he left England, came to the United States in disguise, and he had memorized plans for a factory system and reproduced it here in America. He built a spinning mill for a Quaker merchant named Moses Brown in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. This was in 1790, and this is the first modern factory in America. Eli Whitney. He is one of the most famous people from the Industrial Revolution. Whitney, born in Massachusetts, Yale educated, and he would go on to revolutionize cotton production and weapons manufacturing in the United States. Now, the cotton gin. This invention would drastically reduce the amount of time needed to pick seeds out of cotton. Now, that sounds like a good thing, but this actually has negative results for a lot of people. So there's an enormous demand for cotton that American planters in the South could not fulfill, right? So that's an issue. The British need cotton for their textiles. The North needs cotton for their activities. It's taking too much time to separate the seeds out of the cotton for it to be a profitable activity, and it seems to many that it, like tobacco, may be on its way out. A skilled worker could only clean a few pounds of cotton by hand in a day's work. In 1793, Whitney was working for a tutor on a Georgia plantation, and invented the machine to perform the task of separating the seeds. He actually envisioned this as a way to decrease slave labor, but it actually leads to an explosion in slavery because the cotton gin made cotton a profitable crop, and more people were needed to pick the cotton from the fields to meet the demand that the gin created. Now, gin is an abbreviation for engine. Within a decade, total crop production increased eightfold. And before this, African-American slavery had been seen by many to be in decline. But this definitely revived the institution. It regained its importance and became more firmly fixated in the American South. Whitney's invention also helped connect the agricultural South with the textile-based North. This also helped the North be able to create an American textile industry. Now, Whitney also invented interchangeable parts. This was a pattern that produced identical parts for weapons. His invention of interchangeable parts was a major contribution to modern warfare and eventually other industrial manufacturing techniques. He devised a machine to make each part of a gun according to an exact pattern. One laborer would then be able to quickly assemble a weapon out of parts made by several other people, instead of relying on all these different gun makers making all these different guns and none of them corresponding with one another. This eventually is applied to sewing machines, clocks, and other mechanically complicated products. Begin using that same idea of interchangeable parts. Now, Robert Fulton, a famous inventor. He is promoted by Robert R. Livingston, and they pioneered a steam engine on a boat named the Clermont, which was able to sail up the Hudson River against the current. And after this time, we see a surge in steamboat transportation. Turnpikes are another thing that is growing in popularity. The Lancaster Turnpike is a 60-mile toll road from Philadelphia to Lancaster. It is built by a private company that charged a toll to raise money for their corporation. So this propels the growth of turnpikes in the United States after this. Also, state governments and federal government financed turnpikes into less populated areas, and mountainous terrain also become common. Cities, which are seen as these centers for commerce, learning, and urban culture, are growing during this time period. Philadelphia has as many as 70,000 residents. New York, 60,000 residents. Baltimore, 26,000 residents. Boston, 24,000 residents. Charleston, 20,000 residents. However, the American population is still overwhelmingly rural and agrarian. Only 3% of the population lived in towns of more than 8,000 persons. So that's going to be all for this lecture. Moving forward, going to be getting really into detail on the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Going to go into great detail on his first and second term in office as we discuss Jefferson the president. Be sure you check out Ken Burns' documentary on Thomas Jefferson to double down on that information. We're also going to get into the Louisiana Purchase and the doubling of the national domain by Thomas Jefferson. We'll talk about the ins and outs of that. We'll talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition and also the War of 1812. Those will all be major topics that I'm going to do individual lectures and break them up as much as possible on. So check back, follow along. If you're watching this on YouTube, comment in the video below. Doing this is just an online lecture for my U.S. History 1 class, but uploading it on YouTube as well as in Blackboard. So thank you guys for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll talk to you all soon. Thanks.